Hi everyone, welcome to Frankenstein's Fabrics. This is the first in a series of videos that I'm doing on the methods that I like to use to create a quilt. Now, if you've known me for a while or you've come to classes, I've spoken about how that I actually visualize the finished quilt in my head and then deconstruct it to recreate it in real life. So what I'm wanting to help you with is how to start designing a quilt from scratch so that you can work out your fabrics and your measurements and your cutting and not have to buy a pattern, or if you want to adjust something, things like that. So today's one is we're going to talk first and foremost about how I create from scratch. So whether I'm going to draw something and then work backwards. So what I've got here is, this is just a graph pad from Officeworks. I'll put the link to the products from their website in the comments as well, in the description. So this is a 5mm grid. I generally buy the ones with the holes because occasionally I will store stuff in folders and things like that, so I like that style. I also have purchased, now this is if you're going to create blocks, not the whole quilt. This one here is a 10mm one. As you can see here, I've got a couple of things that I've just been working on, just trying to figure out layout in my head. That's also an Officeworks one. And then later on, when we get into applique and other designing methods, I've also got here the tracing pad. Now this is basically a vellum. If you've ever done any like scrapbooking, pergamano, things like that, a vellum, so it's a see-through one. So you can see, so this is good for tracing, so if you're trying to create an applique shape, that's a good one to have as well. So they're the three most common paper pads that I will use in this series, and just the different methods. Now, I've been quilting for almost 20 years, I think it's like 18 and a bit now. One of the things that I got back in the early days was this book. I don't refer to it greatly now because a lot of it is in my head, but this is a great style of book, so a good reference book, and it's got things in it like cutting for certain things, especially things like set-in triangles and stuff like that. It's really handy, but it's got things like all of your charts for your measurements. So if you need things like this for any reason, it's also got things where you've got diagrams so you can see where things are going to go. If you can find a book like this, I don't know if this one's still in print, but if you do spot it like at a charity shop or someone selling it as a D-stash, that's a great one to pick up. It's very handy. I mean, once you get sort of further along in the book, you'll see things like this where it's to do with your cutting for your angles and things like that. So handy one if you can find it. If not, look for good reference books to put into your library at home. Go for things that will give you definitions and charts like this, so you know, the little cutting guides and things like that, just so that you've got it on hand, and not, because sometimes you go onto Google and you type something in and you get 50 billion answers and you don't know which one to follow if you've got a few that have a slightly different you know, calculation or something, or they've come from different reference points. So something like that's quite handy to have, and because it's a nice little small book, you can keep it next to your machine and things like that. So one of those. Now also for today's session, you will need, so we're going to go with the 5mm today. You will need a ruler, an eraser, and a lead pencil, sharpened please. So what I'm going to take you through is how I decide on the size of a quilt and work backwards so I can create the center of the quilt, and then we'll go from there. So I will get set up, switch the camera around and sort everything out, and we will go from there. Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to take our 5mm graph pad and we are going to go from scratch a particular quilt size and work our way backwards, and then work out the calculations for our fabric. So with our 5mm squares, we're actually going to allow that to be 5 centimeters. So we're going to do this ratio of So what we're going to do is 2 squares is 10 centimeters. So 2 squares is 10 centimeters. So that's 4 inches if you're working in both. I'm going to flick back and forth between inches and centimeters as I do this. So just if you do have trouble with that, make sure you've got a calculator beside you or a tape measure that has both centimeters and inches on it. I do have one of these nice long ones. They're 3 meters long, and we're going to use that as well. So what I want to do is I want to create a quilt from scratch, but I need to make the quilt a specific size. So because I know what size quilt that I want to make, that's how I will start off. So I want to make a quilt that is 150 centimeters square. So a very large lap quilt, if you want to look at it that way. So if we want to go with your measurements, and you look at 150 is 59 inches, so we'll just call it 60 inches just for the sake of rounding it up. So we're looking at 60 inches square. Okay, so first of all, what we want to do is look at our squares, 10 centimeters. So 150 is going to be 15 centimeters. So that's the length that I actually have here on my ruler. So what I'm going to do here is just find the points that are there and draw a line that is 15 centimeters. So that's the top edge of my quilt. I then want to go down the side and do the same, and again on the other side, and again on the bottom, so that I have a square. Now this is where the binding will be on my quilt. So this is my very outside edge of my quilt. Okay, so then I need to decide how big my border is going to be. Now, depending on what design you're thinking of for the center of your quilt, there is sometimes you can look at the ratio of the size of the block you're cutting to the size of the border that you want to make, and make it bigger, smaller, whichever way you think looks best. I generally go a bigger border width to the size of the block that I'm going to make, and I want to do 4-inch squares for the center. So I want my border to be a bit bigger, so I'm going to go 15 centimeters, which is 6 inches. So I come in 3 squares on the diagonal. So 5, 10, 15 centimeters. Okay, and then draw those lines together. Now at this stage I'm not calculating anything other than a layout of what the quilt will look like. Okay, now I don't just want a big border, I also would like an inner border. So I'm going to do a 2-inch border, which is 5 centimeters, so it's 1 square. So come in and draw a second line that is just 1 square wide. And so I have my outer border, my inner border, and now I have my quilt center. So I now can look at the measurement of this centerpiece in both directions, so horizontal and vertical, and calculate how many squares across I want. Now I said before I would like 4-inch squares. Now if that doesn't work, I will adjust it at this point, but that's the thought I have in my mind. So you can use your ruler, or you can count squares, up to you. Okay, so I have 11 centimeters, so I have 1.10 meters. So that allows me to have an even amount of squares, and we're the same in the other direction because we are square. So what I'm now going to do is draw all my lines horizontally and vertically, and then that will create the center of my quilt. So if you just take it slowly, there's no rush. Now the reason I'm doing this is because at a later stage I will be colouring in the squares, and I need to have them clearly defined. So if you don't like the lead pencil over the blue lines, that's fine, but I do prefer drawing the actual lines. Okay, so just go along and draw everything that you need. Now, I know this is a very simple quilt that we're doing, but this is just to show you how you can start to draw your own quilts on graph paper and use the graph paper to help you calculate so you can go shopping. Whether you actually go to a shop or whether you go in and shop your stash, it will allow you to know exactly how much fabric you're going to need for each fabric. And this is part of the reason why I also colour in these designs. Okay, so now we have our quilt ready to go, and we're going to do some maths, the fun part. So what I want to decide is how many fabrics I'm going to put into this section. So if I was being really pedantic and saying I wanted to have every single square across here a different square, I would need 11 fabrics plus my inner border plus my outer border, so that's 13 fabrics all up. And if I choose a separate fabric for my binding, that makes 14 fabrics. Otherwise, what you can do is you can look at the number that you've got here, and you can say you have 5 fabrics. So you'd go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you'd repeat 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's the method I'm going to use today, because we don't really want 14 fabrics in a quilt unless you're doing something very fancy, or you're using a particular range of fabrics and you want to use everything. So normally I would colour this, but for the camera I'm just going to do this. And you will start to see a pattern emerging. Okay, so we now have our 5 fabrics. We have our inner border and our outer border and our binding. So these are all the fabrics that we're going to need for this quilt. We can also calculate backing at this stage as well if you wanted to. So we could do our backing at the bottom here. And your backing size will be the same as your wadding in terms of the extra allowance if you're sending it away to a long arm quilter or if you're quilting it yourself. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with fabric number 1, and because I have a sneaking suspicion, if my maths is right, that there will be 1 extra block of fabric 1 and all of these should be the same, but I'm not 100% on that because that's just a rough guess. So what you want to do is you want to find each block that's going to be fabric 1. So we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. Okay. Now, the other way you can check this instead of counting across the rows is you can check on your diagonal, because you can see here that number 1 runs all the way through the quilt, and so on with each one. You can check the diagonals, and that will give you your numbers as well. Okay, so fabric 5 has 24. Okay, so I think my idea was panning out here. Okay, so I was right. So block 1 will have 1 extra, and I'm assuming it's because of this last one here. So the first row and the second row and the center row all have 3 number 1s. So this will be your cutting guide as well. So if you have a look at what I'm writing down here, so these are the numbers of blocks, and then what we want to do is we need to calculate how much fabric to buy for those blocks. So I'm just going to flip the page here because we're going to need a bit more room for the maths on this. Okay, so we have 25 4-inch squares for fabric number 1. Now we need to add seam allowance, so they need to be at 4.5-inch cut, and we know that the fabric is 44 inches the width of the fabric. However, we don't always worry too much about this. So what I'm going to do here is, this is where you will need your calculator or your tape measure, whatever you prefer using. So we're going to have to work out how many 4.5-inch squares are in 1 strip width of the fabric. So with the width of the fabric here, we can do some maths. Okay, so we have our 44-inch width. Now if you're unsure, you can always drop it down to 40 or 42 just to cover your selvage removal and anything like that. But if you do it at 44, you can generally work it back, round down. Okay, so it says we're going to get 9.7 repeating 4.5-inch squares out of this. So we're going to have 9 squares from 1 cut strip. So to get to 25, so 25 divided by 9, so you're going to need 2.7 strips, so you go 3 strips. So we go 3 by 4.5-inch strips of fabric number 1. Now this maths is going to be exactly the same for every other strip of our colours, so 1 through 5, even though because this one is 25 squares where all the others are 24. So we can come back here and we can say 3 times 4.5 inches is 13.5 inches, times that by 2.5 will get you 33.75 centimeters. So you need to buy 35 to 40 centimeters of fabrics 1 through 5. Now the reason why I've rounded this up is because some shops don't cut with a rotary cutter, some cut with scissors, and you'll have to make adjustments to make sure your fabric is straight before you start cutting your strips. Some shops will tear their fabric, which means you've got to come in a bit. And if you are going to fussy cut things, you will need far more than this. So for instance, if you've got a fabric that has a design on it that you want to fussy cut into the 4-inch squares, you need to count how many of those designs are in the repeat. So most fabrics will repeat in 30, 60 or 90 centimeter repeats. So this means that the pattern, so say it's a star, will start at this point and then there'll be a 30 centimeter thing before that star appears again, and then 30 and 30. Otherwise it's this one to this one, so you get your 60 centimeter repeat, and 90 centimeters are generally things like panels. So take that into consideration, and if that's the case, think about buying at least double that amount, maybe even triple. So you're looking at most 1.20 meters. So consider that, but that's only if you're going to do your repeats and fussy cutting. Okay, so now we know back here that we're going to need 40 centimeters of each of these. Okay, so this is your shopping list. Okay, and I'll get to the cutting list next, but this is the first part. So our 2-inch border all the way around, And we are looking here at 120 centimeters on its outside edge and 110 on the inside edge. So you need to decide where your seam is going to be, whether you're going to join your seam here or here. So on the vertical or the horizontal. And this just means that you're going to decide whether you're going to attach your top and bottom borders first or your side borders first. There's no real hard and fast rule, it is personal preference, but it does depend on what you are doing. And if you are mitering corners, so that's when you do your angled join for things like stripes and things like that, you will need a bit of extra fabric, so we can take that into consideration as well. Okay, so we know at the barest minimum we're going to need 4 strips, just because of the shape of this. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and we know that they're roughly the width of the fabric. So this one is going to be right on the selvage, so is this one, and then we're going to need a little bit extra. So we know just by doing that without even calculating anything, width of fabric or whatever, we know we're going to need 5 strips. So 5 strips, 5 by 2.5 is 12.5 inches, by 2.5 again is 31.25. So that is, so you're going to need 35 centimeters there. So the thing will be, if you are mitering, I'd still get 40. If there's a pattern that you're fussy cutting, get a bit more. So we're looking here 40 centimeters. Now your outer border, same method. You need to decide whether you're going to do a vertical or a horizontal join or a miter. So same premise here, and we're just thinking that through. So we know that the quilt is 150 centimeters square. So we know at the barest minimum, once again, we're going to need 4 strips. But because each side is bigger than the width of the fabric, so if we're joining a vertical join here, the other vertical join is here, this is 120. So we know we need at least 1 strip plus 10-15 centimeters to make up the join plus seam allowance. So we then look at, so it's 1 and a bit strips, 1 and a bit strips. For the side, we know that this is 150, so we're going to have to say it's at least 1 strip at 110 plus 40. So 1 strip and 40, 1 strip and 40. So the extra bits, if you want to calculate it this way, we'll call it 15 centimeters. So 15 and 15 is 30, plus 40 is 70, plus another 40 is 110. That's another strip. So that's 5 strips. However, I would be more inclined to cut 6 because you're going to lose selvages. You are going to, if you're going to miter, you're going to need extra. And if you need to shift where the joins are, so say for instance, we're doing this bottom border and the join that we know is going to make up this extra strip sits here. We don't necessarily want the other one sitting here because what it does is it creates a visual effect of drawing people's eye to that position. So you might join all of your strips together, your 6 strips of your border fabric, and then move it around so that you can get your joins in different positions. So you might want one centered, you might want one slightly offset, and that way you're creating it's a distraction factor. So we want 6 lots of 15 centimeters, so 5, 10, 15, remember it's 6 inches, so 6.5. So we go 6.5 by 6 is 39 inches, times that by 2.5 is 97.5 centimeters. So you need at least 1 meter. Now, if you have a directional print for your border print, so say it's got arrows or writing or something that's got to be put the right way up, you need to buy a full length. So you would need to buy 1.50 meters. So we're going to say here directional print 1.50 m. And the reason is because what you will do, and I'm going to draw this here on this next page, is when you buy your fabric, so we're buying here, this is your 1.50 m, and this is the width of the fabric here at 110. So your selvages are here. You're buying the full length of your border print, whatever that border print may be, and you're going to cut your strips along parallel to the border. Now, 6.5 inches by 6 strips is 97.5 centimeters, so you will fit in to the width of the fabric that way. Okay, so now we're going to look at our binding fabric. So binding fabric maths is a fun one because there's a method, but there's also you can kind of guesstimate at the same time. So we have 150 centimeters square. So fresh page, 4 times the 1.5. So we have 6. So that's going to be 6 strips, 6 meters all up, going around the quilt. Now, if you're not sure it depends on what width you cut your binding as well. Now I cut mine at 3 inches, so we want, I'll show you the regular maths. So it's 4 times 1.5 meters equals 6 meters. You need to divide that by 1.1, so width of fabric. So we go 6 divided by 1.1 equals, you need 5.45 strips. Now, you don't cut 5.5 strips, you will cut 6 strips, which is this anyway. This equation here works better when it's not as consistent, like even sides. It's more when you've got something like a narrow rectangular quilt, so like say single bed quilt, and it's got a shorter horizontal measurement than a longer vertical measurement. So this maths is too simple for this equation that it just gives you back to the same. So we want 6 by, and this is the width of your strip. So most people will cut binding strips at 2.5. I cut mine at 3. So mine will be 18. And I'm just going to do, I'll show you this. So times the 18 by 2.5. That gives you 45 centimeters for your binding. And if you're going to go the other way, 15 by 2.5. I'm just doing this on the calculator because my brain is not really good with migraines lately. So this will equal 37.5 centimeters, so you just buy 40 centimeters. So the difference is not huge. The reason why I cut my strips at 3 inches is because I machine bind front and back, and the 3 inches just gives me a bit more wiggle room. Okay, so we have here our binding. We need 45 centimeters. Now our backing fabric. If you are sending to someone like me a long armour who has to attach it to a frame, you need to make sure that it is 4 inches larger all the way around. Now the reason for that is that on a long arm frame there are what they call leaders, and that is what we attach the backing fabric to, and so they're usually pinned or clamped on in some form depending on what brand of long arm it is, and we need that space so that we can set the pins along the highest edge, put your quilt top in and your wadding in a certain area. And then if we are quilting, we need to be able to swing into the design if it's an edge to edge or something like that. It also allows for if there's any movement in fabric. So there's a thing called pattern creep, and what happens is that as you start quilting, things start to shift because the quilting stitches kind of suck things in a little bit. So there's a slight shift going this way, and then sometimes if you haven't if your quilt is not straight for any reason, or the fabric's got a bit of stretch in it or something like that, sometimes there can be a bit of shift in the angles to the side of the quilt. So what we do is, if we have that extra wiggle room all the way around, it just gives us a better opportunity to get your quilt in the best quality possible at the end of the job. So we go 150 and we need 10 centimeters, so 160, 10 centimeters, so 170. So you need to buy 170 centimeters square, or the 1.7 by whatever the width of the fabric. Now most backing fabrics are something like 2.4 to 2.7, and there are some that are 3 meters wide. So if you buy a wide back, you can buy the 1.7, and doesn't matter what these are. If you are buying fabric to join, you need to make sure that you end up at this size. So you need to buy a certain amount to get to that stage. So you need to buy, this is another one that's a good maths one to show you. So you've got your 150, right? So that's your quilt. And this is our backing, and we know we need 170. So 170, and depending on where you want your join, so there's usually, you can join down the middle, and that works both horizontal and vertical, or you can have a strip down the side and then this bigger piece. It doesn't really matter as long as the join is nice and flat. You can match patterns if you want, but you will need to buy more fabric. So if you just want to create this size and just buy whatever, you can just buy 1.7 by 2, so you've got your 3.4 meters. So what will happen is you will have a 1.7 meter drop, and across here will be 2.2, because what you've done is you've created the join across here that will give you, that will give you, so it's the 1.1, and the 1.1 is the width of the fabric. If you don't want to buy excessive amounts of fabric, what you can do is you can calculate. So we know 1.7 here, 1.7 here. So you can go, I know where 1.1 is. I'm going to need 60 centimeters here, and I'm going to need 1.7 here. So 1.7, so you're going to need a 1.1 mark here, and you know you're going to need 60 centimeters here. So what you would be buying is 1.7 plus your 60. So you've got one piece that's 1.7 by 1.1. So we'll just draw this here. So that's this piece here, okay? And then you need a 60 centimeter piece by the width of the fabric. It's this piece here. And then you need to calculate these other two smaller pieces. So this will be 60 by 1.1 again. So another 60. And then at this piece here will be 60 by 60. So it's a little bit bigger than a fat quarter. So what you would be buying, you'd still be buying another 60 centimeter piece. So this will give you here 1.8 plus 1.7, which is actually more than if you bought this. So that's if you're fiddling, or if you're going to join your leftover fabrics, if you had any, or if you've got other pieces, or you're just putting plain things in, because you can piece your backing. It does not have to be a whole piece, but you could use, say you've got the really nice piece that matched the front, you could even put it in the center. So you could do your backing fabric with a nice big piece in the middle, and then you could fill these bits around, and you could cobble together this sort of thing. But as long as it ends up 170 square and is stable for your quilt top, that will work. So I would stick to, if you're not used to piecing a backing, I would stick to buying your 1.7 meters by the width of a wide back fabric. So now we have our shopping list. So we now have to move to our cutting list. So I'm going to show you fresh paper. I'm just going to take this one off the front. And I'll come back to here. So we know that we need 3 strips. So what we're going to do is we're going to have our fresh page for our cutting list. So fabric number 1, and this will be the same for fabrics 1 through 5, except you'll be cutting 1 extra square for fabric 1. So we have here 4.5 inch strip. We need 9 squares from each strip, so we're going to cut 3 strips. So fabric 1 is cut 3 strips at 4.5 inches, cross cut 9 4.5 inch squares from each strip. Now this is not going to be 100% because 3 9s are not 25, but you get what I mean here. So then this is fabrics numbers 2 to 5. That's the cutting. Now we go inner border, and we had 40 centimeters for our inner border, and we want to cut 5 strips at 2.5 inches. They will then be, now this is to cover your seams, join end to end, press seams, measure, okay, I'll explain this right now because this is the thing that is very important with borders. So this little piece here is when you're starting to assemble. Now the reason why I've written it here is because 5 strips doesn't make sense when you look at the picture, because you know there's 4 sides to the quilt. So this is going to be the same for both inner and outer border. You're cutting the strips to the measurement that you need. You then join them end to end and you press the seams open, okay? So this, imagine you've already assembled the centerpiece of your quilt. What you are then going to do is you are going to measure through the center of your quilt from the raw edge of your square piece to the raw edge of the square piece, and that measurement is what you would cut one of those borders to. So the top border, you would also cut the bottom border to that size. Now the reason why we're measuring through the center of the quilt is because this is the most stable point. If you measure on that raw edge, you will get a stretch, you will get a false measurement. Then what will happen is your border will not attach correctly, and then when it's going to be quilted, you will end up with a ripple. So you measure through the center of the quilt, you attach the top and the bottom border, press the seams, then you measure from the top of the border you've just attached to the bottom border that you've just attached, and that measurement is what you cut your side borders to. When you're attaching it to the quilt to sew it on, what you do is you find the center and put a pin. You put a pin right on either edge, and then you pin roughly. So I usually do like a couple of quarters. So I find my center, and then I'll find the center of this gap, and then I'll find the center of a couple of spots. If you've got anything that's kind of sagging a bit, what you're going to be doing is easing that in. And the reason why we're doing this is because what it will do is it will square everything up again, because this measurement, once again, is this most stable point, and it will keep everything nice and square. Then, once you've attached these 2 borders, press the seams, and then you repeat the process for your outer border. And this will keep everything nice and square, and it means your long arm quilter won't have to fiddle with starch, extra wadding, putting a pleat in, or anything like that. And it will make your quilt a lot squarer, a lot neater, and a lot easier for your long armor to quilt. So, outer border. We had, it was 6 strips. did we say? Yes. So we're going to cut six strips at 6.5 inches, and then repeat this process. Okay, your binding, cut, and we said 6 again, didn't we? Yes, we did. 6 strips at 3 inches. Now binding is join end to end at a 45-degree angle, trim, and press seams open. Okay, and then you fold in half, wrong sides together, and press. Okay, so that is a basic quilt. Now, I know I've got a lot of scribble going on here, so basically what you need to do is, by drawing your quilt, calculating your shopping, and then calculating your cutting, and laying it out like this so you can see everything, will give you the best possible chance of getting the quilt together without losing bits or not having enough fabric and things like that. So this is just basic squares. Now, this same premise can be used if you're going to be using things like rectangles. You just make sure you count your squares to get your measurements. Now, I will come back at a later date and do a quilt that's a bit more complicated than this. I will do things with triangles and stuff like that, but we will get to that at that stage. But at this point in time, this is the bare bones of what it does, what I do to create a quilt. So graph paper, a pencil, an eraser, and a ruler are your best friend. If you do use software for creating your quilts, by all means. I personally don't like using software because I feel like this to me is a bit more tactile and it sinks into my head a lot better, so that when I actually start cutting and sewing, it's already in my head. I've memorized it because I've actually physically written it out. So that's one of the things that I prefer to do. So up to you, but if you do use software, nothing against it, it's just not for me. So if you have any questions about this process, please let me know. Details will be below in the description box. I'll also pop the links up for all of the books that I've purchased from Officeworks, and if you do need any extra help, feel free to get in touch, and we'll go from there. So this is the first in the Maths Methods Tips and Techniques. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.